Hi, everybody. So today in this video, we are going to end up dealing with the topic of deconstruction. It's a word that I think was really big at least a couple years ago. Not sure if it's quite as big a thing now, but the word still carries a little bit of punch in skeptical online discourse. Now, generally, it's understood that this will usually lead to a significant change in someone's thinking, whether that means they give up religious belief altogether and become an atheist or whatever, or just, develop a more flexible idea of Christianity or spirituality. Usually some kind of change is going to take place. However, I recently found a video where a Christian said that deconstruction actually made his faith stronger, which sounds just a tiny bit fishy to me. But let's see what he has to say. Now, a quick word before we get started. I guess first, please like, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff. If you're interested in my Patreon, you can go over there and have a look. I'm going to try to do the first patron-only live stream on May 11th, so in about 2 weeks. Also, one thing I want to say, this can be a little touchy what I'm going to talk about. We have a person who says that they went through a certain process of deconstructing their faith and ended up still a really strong believer. While parts of that sound a little iffy to me, I don't first off want to come off as judging his thinking. I might end up evaluating that to some extent, but I don't want to judge what's going on in his mind. We get plenty of that from Christians, and I don't want to dish it back. Also, I don't want to be a gatekeeper of what the word deconstruction means and whether he actually deconstructed. But I think there is room to evaluate the thought process that he claims led him to be a stronger Christian or have a stronger, more solid faith, and whether that seems to align with the common usage of the word deconstruction. And so I hope you can pick the right nuance out of what I'm trying to say in this video. Anyway, I'm going to skip parts of this. He does say he rambles. He's working without any kind of script or outline. So I'm going to skip parts of it, including the beginning. Go watch his video if you're not really sure if I'm giving it a fair shake. See all that he has to say. I would encourage you to do that in general, just so you can pick out the nuance. But sometimes just for pacing, you got to skip over some of that stuff. So we're going to pick up about 37 seconds into his video here.
I watch a lot of YouTube videos about spiritual deconstruction. By the way, I hope the title of this is not clickbaity. To be clear, I'm a Christian. I'm a pastor.
Now, I really do appreciate his caution about this, but I don't see his title as clickbaity. He does say that, his faith survived. So unless he changed it, it all seems accurate. However, there is a little bit of a curiosity here. It seems like he does acknowledge that deconstructing and remaining Christian is a little unusual.
So my experiences of spiritual deconstruction, if that's the right term, 2 seasons of real doubts and angst and struggle resulted in a stronger faith. And that's kind of just to lay my cards on the table. That's where I'm coming from here. But
okay, so I'm not going to lie. I am a little skeptical when I hear him say that he deconstructed and it made his faith stronger. So again, I'm not going to try to read his mind. I'm not going to try to gatekeep the word deconstruction, but this just doesn't sit right with me. Part of it is, to be perfectly frank, I don't think the idea of Christianity stands up well to scrutiny. So something about the idea of picking through it and just believing what you do even more sounds a little bit fake. And I'm not saying this just as a jab against Christianity. I think a lot of Christians do believe this. That's why they shelter their kids so much. That's why they have this neurosis against protecting from outside ideas. I think they understand that you need to curate this very careful experience of learning only things from your faith, and that examining things too close doesn't go well for people in the religion, or it doesn't go well for the place the religion has in their lives. So Christianity, I think, has this inherent vulnerability to deconstruction that makes his claim sound a little iffy. And again, understood by Christians and atheists alike to some extent. But, take that as my atheist bias, if you will. I think it's fair to chalk it up to that, so I don't just want to leave it there. But still, even granting that, this does smell just a little bit much like a Christian trying to co-opt the language of skepticism. Basically, it sounds like an I used to be an atheist story, right? It's just that instead of starting atheist and then looking into Christianity, responding to reductive arguments for God in a formulaic way, and then converting, he'll start a believer, but then begin deconstructing, respond to reductive arguments for God in a formulaic way, and then return to the faith. Pretty neat and easy in either case, and maybe suspiciously neat and easy in either case. I suspect, don't know, just suspect, that like with the I used to be an atheist story, the point is just to get the main character to a place where they're having doubts that can be conclusively settled by basic apologetics. Now, the reason this sounds suspicious is that the apologetics are presented in this really reductive way that I don't think would be convincing to anybody outside the religion. At most, these might be the beginning of a conversation, not the conclusion of a conversation, if they're even worth that. So to have this story where somebody's like, again, this is supposed to be a non-believer or somebody seriously doubting their faith. Wow, the universe must come from something, or 500 people saw the risen Jesus. Now I believe in God more than ever. I don't know. It just seems evidently silly. But the problem is the silliness is a bug, not a feature. It might seem incredibly silly and uncompelling to any outsiders, but to insiders, what it does is makes the whole argument a little less threatening. If the arguments are just incredibly accessible and everybody in a church pew can immediately get their heads around, and also the arguments immediately convince any sincere skeptic, even super smart ones like, Lee Strobel and J. Warner Wallace and Josh McDowell, if people as smart as that were instantly convinced, well, then you have the whole thing in a nutshell. You as a Christian have nothing to fear from atheism. It's not this mysterious thing. It's just a bunch of people running around, being silly because they've never heard these basic arguments. So, it's doing exactly what it's meant to do. And on top of that, probably the biggest thing is that it shows that actual skeptical inquiry will lead you to Christianity, not away from it. That's why I say it's co-opting the language of skepticism. So what I'm wondering is what kind of story we're going to see here today. Are we going to see a really messy story of Gavin contending deeply with a lot of complex philosophical issues? Are we going to see him showing a high level of awareness of what and how non-believers think, or at least just of basic information that he'd run into if he really explored far outside his faith? Or are we just going to see him come to a basic apologetic, realize that it's true in a very formulaic, curated way, and, just very neatly go straight back to what he believes for really obvious reasons that are predictable to anybody who's read an apologetics book? Which of these are we going to see? And to be clear, I am going to be very skeptical if we see the second one. It's not that I think that deconstruction should automatically lead to disbelief. I don't think it should break your arguments for God necessarily. Kind of think it most likely would in most cases. But at the very least, you should see these arguments bend under the strain of whatever he investigates. There should be some kind of tension. He should really seriously wonder whether the first cause argument, or the 500 eyewitnesses, or whatever evidence they have for the resurrection. He should show these strain under arguments that he actually pulled out from the secular world and saw from all sides. If that doesn't happen, I don't know if we can call what he did deconstruction. Now, to be clear, I wouldn't take that as meaning he's lying. I just think it's really easy for a lot of Christians to skim easy answers, feel like they've tackled doubts that are bothering them, and just kind of pack their doubts away and think they're solved. A lot of Christians do it. I did it at a certain point when I was a Christian. So I can see where he's getting at with all this, if that's the direction he goes.
But I also thought, I see this is a huge movement. I see so many stories of spiritual deconstruction right now. Really, it's got me alarmed because narrative and testimony is so powerful. So I'm seeing all these people sharing their stories about how they're deconstructing, and I feel like that gains momentum in so many people. And I don't want people to do that. I want people to deconstruct the things that are bad about their faith. Like feel like I've been through a little bit and probably will always go through, but not their faith itself.
Now, see, this gives me even more reason to wonder. It sounds like the stated thesis of his video is that he's trying to co-opt the term deconstructed, kind of like I suspected. When most ex-evangelicals tell their deconstruction story, they're just telling their story for what it is. It's just the raw story of how they got where they are, and that's the whole purpose of it. They might be doing this so that they can finally air out something that they've had to hold inside for a long time. You usually can't tell all your friends and family about this kind of stuff. Or they might be trying to encourage other people who are having doubts that what they're going through is normal and they're not alone. But they're not trying to direct people along any specific path. Gavin, on the other hand, came out and told us that he does have this kind of agenda. He does want people to go along a specific path. See, he literally tells us that the deconstruction trend troubles him. People's journeys taking them wherever they take them troubles him. And so he wants to tell a counter story about how you actually can get back on the straight and narrow path. This seems a lot like the opposite of the purpose of, most deconstruction stories, or the very idea of deconstruction, which is supposed to be a lot more open-ended. But in a way, I can get the point of what he's saying. Deconstruction stories are meant to be a form of encouragement, right? You're using your story to encourage others. But the big difference here is that in most deconstruction stories, the point is to encourage them that whatever they're going through, it's okay that they might end up here, here, or here. The point is that the open-ended journey itself is all right. Gavin's story, on the other hand, is saying that it's okay because your story won't be open-ended, that you will come back to the faith that you held in the beginning. And he's going to reiterate that a lot in very specific terms. So this comes off as a bit of a stunning admission and makes me feel a little better for being suspicious of what his story's about. Basically, I don't see his video as being part of the deconstruction genre. I see it as an openly stated refutation of the genre. And if you think again that I'm being too harsh on him or that I'm reading too much between the lines, listen to what he says. He says he wants people to deconstruct bad things about the faith, but not the faith itself. This tells me a couple things. First, he wants people to still believe at the end of their deconstruction process. And second, he's actually afraid that if they unpack and examine Christianity, they might not believe. So if I'm taking him at his word, he doesn't want people to really deconstruct. He wants to, again, co-opt the word to describe a very guarded process that will end up affirming your faith. And if this is what he wants other people to do, I suspect it's what he did. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot of further explanation, which includes an explanation of the fact that he doesn't use an outline, which explains why we have to skip over some of this, and get to the beginning of his actual deconversion story. I'm sorry, actual deconstruction story. Slip of the tongue there.
For me, I would say if I had to identify, what have I been through on this? I would say there's been 2 seasons in my life where I've just worked through kind of the classical worry, I guess, just to put it as simply as I can, of what if I'm wrong? And one of those was in college, the other was more recent. And both of them had an intellectual component and then other components. I'd say more recently, there was just this feeling of disillusionment based upon political dynamics in recent years. I'm recording this video in 2021, up until January of this year, and then climactically then.
So he's being a little careful with how he says it, but I think we know what he's getting at here, right? He's alluding to evangelical Christianity's association with MAGA extremism and its climax at the U.S. Capitol. And it sounds like he's a little trouble with that. I really appreciate this. I know a lot of Christians who, are troubled by this too, and they confide in me a lot because of it. Some of them tend to associate more with people like me than with a lot of the extremists in their own church. I honestly really do appreciate hearing this coming from Gavin, but we're still left with a pretty big question in light of the fact that this is supposed to be part of a deconstruction process. He says he's disillusioned, but is he disillusioned with the faith itself in any way? Is this causing him to question core tenets of Christianity, any of its supernatural beliefs? Maybe how things about the Church of Christianity at its fundamental level might encourage this? If he is, then this did prompt a certain amount of deconstruction. If not, he's not really deconstructing the actual elements of his faith. He's just breaking down how certain people lived up to the faith as he understood it and evaluating them, not the faith itself. I'm not so sure I would call that deconstruction. But this is a good sign, so let's just keep watching and see where this goes.
It's been a brutal season for many of us who use the label evangelical and feel that label's been taken up into contexts because of the political environment that are not what we'd want to be associated with. And that has been disillusioning to the extent that it's been hard.
So this, I would say, pretty much by definition doesn't have anything to do with deconstructing the faith. It's him being concerned about public perception. He's talking about how the public views the word evangelical and whether that's something he wants to be associated with, which I understand, but let's just be clear about what process we're talking about here. Now, he does make a pretty courageous and I'd say apt comparison between how the church reacts to MAGA today and how it reacted to politics in, 1930s Germany. But I'm going to skip over it for the sake of time and get to some other stuff he started to question.
But I'm just trying to set the context because, I mean, as recently as the things that came out with Ravi Zacharias, I would have thought of Ravi Zacharias as like, in my naivety, until recent things. I don't know, maybe I'm being too honest, but I would have thought of him as like a more trustworthy person, whereas other prominent Christian ministers and leaders, you can see, oh wow, there's a trail of smoke behind him. Obviously there's issues, but then with him,
now, he was disappointed in Ravi Zacharias for some understandable reasons. Look up why if you don't know, but I'm not going to go into it here. But I find his reaction kind of weird. It seemed like he thought he could sniff out good versus bad character based on public persona. I mean, he literally thought that a righteous person should look one way and an unrighteous person should just be throwing up red flags all over the place. Like, I think have a trail of smoke behind him is how he put it. And this is just a totally unrealistic expectation. Now, I get it, we can all be disappointed when a public figure doesn't live up to our expectations of them. Atheists like us have dealt with this a lot, but I think we get that their public persona is this and their private life is this, and they're not always going to match up. And, those people might let us down. I don't know, you should be able to separate those two things. And it seems like Gavin didn't. Now, it could be all too easy for me to read too much into why Gavin was this shaken up by Ravi Zacharias. It might have just been a personal lapse on his part. In fact, he says that he was too naive. But I think there could be more to it than that. By its nature, Christianity trains people to become too invested in the idea of a godly leader and to look to individuals to be a shepherd, to guide people through either some closer connection to God than everybody else has or some better understanding of Scripture. And this is just an inherently dangerous dynamic. Now, it's not going to lead everybody to be instantly credulous to everybody they hear over a pulpit, but I think it leads people to look for too many signs that a public figure is this kind of godly leader and invest too much trust into them. There is a danger there that's inherent to the faith and that you might want to try to dig up if you really want to understand what's going on here. Now, here's the thing. Does Gavin need to dig into all that? No. He could just recognize that he had an issue being too trusting and deal with that in isolation. He doesn't need to dig all this stuff up and decide whether it was a problem with, the core of Christianity itself. But if he doesn't, then he's not really deconstructing. And why do you bring this up? Why do you bring up somebody like Ravi Zacharias or things like MAGA if you're not going to really look into how Christianity fed into those things? Again, if this is actually going to be a deconstruction story. This seems to reflect something he told us near the beginning, which is that he wants to deconstruct the bad things, but not the faith itself. And I think we're seeing what that means. It means that he's not actually looking at the essentials of Christianity. He's not questioning his actual faith. He's kind of dealing with some peripheral things and leaving the faith itself alone.
I don't know. I've had a lot of experiences where you get let down by somebody. Somebody lets you down, and you start to be afraid. Oh no, what if I'm becoming cynical? Because the questions that keep coming up are, who's next, and can I trust anybody? The cynicism, the fear of cynicism comes in when it's like, is this just shot through American evangelicalism to the point where it's everywhere and it's just the whole thing is just diseased or something like that? I don't know. I mean, these are the kinds of questions. I don't even have answers. These are just the things I'm working through.
Now, he's bringing up the beginning of some really good questions here, right? The issue then is how deeply he's going to explore these. And I mean explore them in light of what they mean about his faith, if he's actually deconstructing Christianity itself. We've already seen him, look at Ravi Zacharias and just see it being a problem with Ravi and his own credulity rather than any issue with Christianity and the nature of the religion and how it fed into that. Same thing with MAGA. He talked about how he thinks MAGA is troubling. He thinks that certain people within the faith are behaving badly, enough people that it affects how people see the faith. But there are a lot of questions, too, about how Christianity itself inherently feeds into things like the MAGA movement. And I haven't seen him touch that. I'm not so sure that he will. Christianity teaches you to look for a Messiah figure, right? Now, on paper, that Messiah should only be Jesus. But once you've trained people that you look for a single hero figure to solve all your personal and spiritual problems, How big a leap is it to get from there to thinking that one specific political hero is going to solve all of your social ills? It doesn't necessarily have to go that way for everybody, but there is a fundamental form of intellectual laziness there that is encouraged by the faith. And I don't think you're going to go from applying that kind of laziness here to, thinking a lot more constructively here in this other area of your life. Christianity also gives you this feeling that it's only natural and desirable that society be remade into this image of holiness that you have. There's this very easy, understandable idea of what we should be as a society, and building that isn't a matter of nuanced social change. It's a matter of rooting out some malevolent force, and once you do that, everybody should be just like you. Everybody should behave in this really homogenous way that is compliant to and consistent with your understanding of Christianity. I don't see how you can't separate that from the nature of the religion itself. Again, not all Christians have to be thinking this way, but there is a root form of thinking there that encourages Christian nationalism and ultimately MAGA thinking. So again, Gavin doesn't have to dig into all this stuff, but if he's not, how is this much of a deconstruction? We keep coming back to this same question. Is he really deconstructing the faith, or is he just attacking peripheral issues and leaving the core of the faith itself alone? In fact, Gavin actually expresses a fear of his process getting him too close to these core beliefs. Once questions of Ravi Zacharias or MAGA culture bring up the question of whether American evangelicalism is just rotten to the core, he doesn't want to delve in and unpack that. He expresses a fear that that very question will make him too cynical, and it seems like he doesn't really want to go there. And keep in mind, this isn't unpacking Christianity as a whole. This is just unpacking his modern, current American idea of Christianity. If he doesn't even want to go there, what is this process then? Again, it's fine and great that he wants to question corrupt Christian leaders. It's absolutely wonderful that he wants to question MAGA and maybe get his faith away from there, but it's not deconstructing the faith. By definition, it's just not.
So there's that side of it, just, having grown up within American evangelicalism and just all those kinds of worries. And then there's the intellectual side, where at various points I've kind of just hit something and realized, it's not what I thought. It's not as simple as I thought. The world is more complicated. Truth is more complicated.
So now we're shifting gears to more intellectual topics. And this is the part I'm a little bit more curious in, because this actually gets to the core of what he believes in, right? It's one thing to be troubled by peripheral issues. It's another to actually go in and address reasons why you believe in God. So it'll be more interesting. And I think this is where we might start to see whether this is organic versus formulaic. Depends on whether he actually seems to be questioning these reasons to believe versus just reiterating apologetics and calling it good.
Issues related to creation and evolution. That's been a big one for me. I've taken a lot of flack for my views on those things. I'm more open to evolution at this point.
Now, I'm not going to lie. This sounds very reasonable. A lot of Christians start with questioning young earth creationism. And in fact, that's what I started with myself. And I stayed Christian for at least 15 years after seriously questioning it and I think giving it up. And by the way, that included time I spent running a young earth creationist Baptist school, which was a little awkward. So I can see how someone honestly becomes skeptical of young earth creationism without actually even deconverting. This is kind of a promising start. Makes me wonder if his story won't be as contrived as I originally thought.
I'm more open to evolution at this point, though I'm not sure. I'm not a scientist, so the whole thing is I'm trying to be careful, but I'm on record for this so I guess it's safe to say, but I'm more open to evolution at this point. And I've slowly, my arguments for intelligent design have been sort of slowly loosened. They've loosened in their grip on me and on my convictions, because I've just seen, I don't think that actually is necessarily a compelling argument. So I'm still sort of not settled on the details of that issue.
Now I can really sympathize with how he tiptoes his way around the question of evolution. I myself had to do a lot of, I'm not a scientist and I haven't come to a lot of specific conclusions, but when talking to other Christians. So, I can see where this comes from. You got to be careful if you still want to talk to a Christian audience and let young earth creationists go, especially with American Christians. In fact, I wouldn't be too surprised if people who knew me when I was a Christian are like, well, see, he questioned young earth creationism and now look where he is, he's an atheist and all that.
And as again, as you're going to find out by the end of this, I'm still absolutely committed not only to theism, but to the integrity of the Genesis creation account, and to, for instance, that there was really a person named Adam and things like that.
Well, promising a start as it was, this just dove right off a cliff, didn't it? Because did you hear what he just assured his audience of? That he's committed to the Genesis account and to theism. This just doesn't work. You can't deconstruct if you're committed to a certain belief. You're not following the evidence where it leads. You already have a conclusion in mind, and everything you do, if not trying to lead to that conclusion, is at least beholden to it. So you're going to direct your thoughts in a way that totally undermines the process of deconstruction, or you're going to keep certain topics out of reach and just not go there, which again leads to at best a very incomplete deconstruction, probably one that doesn't actually get to the core tenets of your faith, and thus isn't actually deconstructing the faith itself. So basically, and I don't want to read too much into this, but we have to take him at his word, he pretty much just declared this whole thing as a farce. Now, he's going to spend a lot of time talking about Rhett McLaughlin and his disbelief in evolution and where that took him on his journey. So we're going to skip over all that and get back to where Gavin talks about his own perspective.
My journey has been different. What I've been through, and I don't know if part of this is my personality. I try to be conservative in terms of don't over, because I know that most intellectual errors happen by means of overreaction, or if not most, many. You're over here, you realize that's wrong, so you go zoom all the way to the other side. So much of the way of the world. That's how things go. Well, so I try to not do that.
This is a legitimately good point. If you're a new atheist or even just someone asking questions, I would suggest being very slow and deliberate about really trying to understand what questions you have and about changing your mind. Don't just go rushing to and fro every time a question comes up. So you can take it slow. Start with one topic and then take your time unpacking it without instantly changing your ideas about everything related to your faith. But then once your thoughts on that have gelled, what do? Take his story, for instance. Say he questions creationism and it leads him to the conclusion that the earth is old and evolution happened. This might bring up questions about how literally true Genesis is. If he fully unpacks that, it might bring up questions about biblical inerrancy in general. And that might bring up other questions. And somewhere along the way, he might independently start having questions about whether God exists at all. So the question is he willing to continue progressing through these strings of questions on an open-ended basis? Will he keep going slow as he wants to take the process, or is there a point where he plans to stop? Is there a line he won't cross? Or to put it in other words, his words, is he committed to specific answers on any of these topics? It sounds like he's conflating taking it slow with having limits to what you're actually going to ask questions about. And these are very different things. It's rushing to a conclusion versus not being willing to go to certain conclusions. And in fact, if you're committed to staying at a conclusion, that's rushing to a conclusion itself, right? It's just the one you already had. After this, he talks about Bart Ehrman and the question of whether Jesus claimed to be God, and we're going to skip over all that because it just is a lot of detail, and I don't find the question of what Jesus claimed to be all that consequential. Anyway, let's pick up here.
That's one example of where I don't agree with Bart Ehrman. I'm like, no, I think the Gospels are incredible historical resources for ancient history, and I think the portrait that they yield is consistently of this man who claimed to be God.
So this is a little weird, and I guess there's some nuance here. Yeah, sure. The Gospels are good historical resources if you want to better understand the thinking of an ancient apocalyptic cult and the religion that sprung from it. Maybe some other details there too. Maybe it can say something about the question of whether there was a historical Jesus. Not gonna go there. But if you think they're incredible historical resources and that they accurately depict the workings of a supernatural Jesus who was a God-man, and you even entertain the idea that every word in them is true, then I'm sorry. You're still leaning so far into conventional apologetics that I don't think you've even begun to introspect on, much less meaningfully deconstruct, anything about your religion or the arguments surrounding them. At the very least, somebody even starting to seriously analyze their faith would recognize that, given the supernatural claims of these documents and their stated theological purpose, they might have enough bias in there to, ask a lot of questions about what they're saying. That's like basic square one deconstruction. If you haven't even opened that can of worms, it sounds like you're just taking your religion at its word because it's your religion.
And therefore, the Lord, liar, lunatic, or legend, because we want to add on that category, argument is still on the table.
Okay, seriously. You couldn't come up with a much more transparently flawed conclusion-seeking argument than lunatic, liar, or Lord. It's basically an argument from ignorance, and, legend is only the most obvious counterexample. Even these terms themselves are just incredibly simplified the way they're presented. Like, you can be deluded into thinking you have some level of divinity without being some raving lunatic. Or you can mislead people about the same thing to some degree without being a, total terrible liar. And by the way, once you were a liar or had told a lie about this, that wouldn't rule out the fact that you could teach anything good from then on. Like, I don't know, this whole thing where they say, well, if he was a liar, then someone wouldn't lie about that and teach the good things Jesus did, like assuming the stuff Jesus taught was all that great to begin with. This is the line of reasoning of someone obviously trying to come to the right answer. Like, I had fully deconstructed and dropped this line of reasoning in my early 20s, I think, when I still had a lot of Christianity ahead of me. I don't know. You really haven't wandered far off the farm if you're compelled by this to any degree whatsoever.
And so in other words, what my spiritual deconstruction has looked like is deconstructing some things, but coming back to the core and finding it stronger and more durable than I ever anticipated.
And see, he keeps telling us that he's not actually deconstructing his religion. If you deconstruct some things and then come back to the core of your religion, then your deconstruction did not happen at the core of your religion. You were off deconstructing peripheral ideas that were not essential to it.
And I passionately believe with all my heart that if people who go through that process kind of take it step by step, they will have a similar experience.
I think here we're getting close to the core point of the video. Gavin's assuring Christians that if they were to properly deconstruct, they would just end up with a stronger faith. Or his words are a more durable faith. Now, this word durable is important and kind of telling, because what does it mean for something to be durable? It means that it stays strong, it doesn't change, it lasts. So if he wants you to come to a durable faith, he wants you to end up with conclusions that aren't going to change. That seems to be at odds with the very idea of deconstruction. Deconstruction should be an ongoing process. It should be perpetually asking questions. No matter where you are, you don't just want to land there and stay there. You keep wanting to unpack what you believe and evolve and grow as a person. That's what I do as an atheist, I didn't deconstruct my Christianity and just try to land at a durable form of atheism. That'd be messing up the whole point, right? I would still be giving into the kind of fundamentalist thinking that I was trying to escape from as a Christian. So when Gavin says this, not only, as we've seen throughout this video, is he trying to target a specific conclusion, but he's treating deconstruction as just this temporary little adventure. It's not the point. It's not where you want to be. It's this, I don't know, he almost treats it as an unfortunate thing. You don't want to dwell in a deconstructing mindset. You want to go out and deconstruct and then come back and end up with your reward being that now you can just keep believing what you believe. Now, this assurance, of course, is a natural extension of the stated point of his video. His stated point is that he wants to show Christians that they can deconstruct and end up where they are, right? They had this avalanche of deconstruction stories where people stop believing at least Christianity as he understands it, and he wants to show this can work the other way too, right? So it's very didactic. He has a specific point, and he wants people to land at a specific conclusion. In order for that to happen, he needs to depict things a very specific way. Deconstruction can't just show that things are actually messy and up for question and that you can't really be sure about things. You need to be certain to the point that if you encounter an apologetic, that immediately reverses any doubts you have. So what I think the rest of the story is going to look like is him having a doubt, encountering a very basic apologetic in a form that's familiar and easy for Christians to get their minds around, and then having that apologetic immediately put his questions to rest. And then, what do you know, he circles back and his faith becomes more durable than ever. You need each step here to be formulaic, carefully controlled, and just validate not only their beliefs, but how easy and predictable it is to get to those beliefs. Now, Gavin has already started doing this with his "the Gospels are amazing historical resources" and "lunatic liar and Lord" thing. And what we're going to see is him just skipping from one apologetic to the other and showing that, it just immediately put all his doubts to bed and made him realize that Christianity was true all along for the same reasons all along, basically. So I'm going to skip over a lot of his preliminary stuff and him unpacking how he got to these questions, so you can watch that if you want.
That's been like when you're walking up a uneven set of stairs and there's a guardrail, you can put your hand on the guardrail. That's what that argument, the cosmological argument, the idea that God is the best explanation for our universe because everything that begins to exist has a cause. Or I actually like to go away from that argument, what's called the Kalam cosmological argument, and just put it more broadly, because basically you need to say, even if the universe was eternal, we need a first cause. We need something that stops the causal chain.
So I don't think anybody was surprised to see this coming. First cause is a common part of this genre. And I guess that's fine. It's understandable. People think the universe needs a cause. Of all the arguments here, I think this is the one that would most likely appeal to people outside the faith. It just seems logically inevitable. The beginning of the universe, if it had a beginning the way we understand it, is kind of puzzling. Problem is, you're just taking your eyeball level intuition that every effect has a cause and, looking at the ways things work in our immediate environment now and generalizing that to things that are like the beginning of the universe. Once you get to things like that, space-time probably works in a way that totally defies our intuition. So you're just putting intuition where it doesn't belong. So, this is flawed from the beginning, and I think we all know that kind of thing. I think really the only legitimate conclusion we could reach about this is that the universe is here for reasons that are so complex that they totally blow our mind. And trying to sit there and use logic to deduce your way to what a cause would have been if there were a cause is just a little bit silly. And that gets to where this, of course, really runs off the rails, is where you go from concluding that some cause must have been at the beginning of the universe to thinking that it must be a conscious being. There is simply no reason to come to that conclusion. It might be a little intuitive in a misleading way, but in general, the only reason you come to that conclusion is you're trying to justify a religion. Couldn't put it more plainly than that. Also, I think something at the core of this is the only reason you feel like you need this answer is a religious one. I don't think most people are that unsettled by the fact that they can't reason their way back to what caused the universe. They can easily compartmentalize that as a complicated scientific thing that they don't need to know, kind of like a lot of other complex parts of science. So the demand that every person in the world needs to find an immediately accessible answer for where the universe came from, I don't think that's a natural line of reasoning. I think it's more of a post hoc justification for the faith. And it's a little bit telling that this is somewhere he parks as a Christian.
We need some explanation for why contingent things are here.
No, you don't. In fact, I think one of the first things you should learn in the deconstruction process is that apologetics has trained you to think you need these answers and just wake up to the fact that it's okay to say you don't know about stuff like this. Because the fact is you don't.
And it makes such sense, and it's as comfortable as putting your feet into your slippers in the morning to assume that necessity is the context in which to understand contingency.
And thus we see the danger of comfortable answers to complicated questions.
And then you get to the argument from design, which has never been my favorite argument. I've always avoided it. But then in the context of my research, I'm realizing, wow, sometimes you can tell the strength of an argument by what the counter arguments are.
I myself have never taken the better of two bad arguments as a good argument approach, but I guess to each their own.
The best counter argument, and really only primary counter argument on the market to the argument from design, that God is the best explanation for the physical constants that are so highly tuned such that our universe can be life permitting. The best and primary response to that is the multiverse hypothesis.
No, that is not the only counter to the design argument. In fact, I'd say it's not even one of the better ones. To give a few examples, and I have a whole video about these, by the way, if you're interested. There's the fact that most of the universe would kill us, the likelihood that we adapted to our environment instead of the environment being designed for us, the question of whether the constants in the universe could even be different than they are, the question of whether we can properly perceive design or lack of design in a universe we're part of, and most damning of all, the fundamental absurdity of an all-powerful God designing us with weaknesses and then designing the universe to accommodate those weaknesses. It doesn't make any sense. And people bring up these arguments all the time. Like, hell, I just had to Google the words problems with the design arguments and, I got all kinds of answers. That's all you have to do if you have any curiosity on this topic. Did Gavin not Google the words problem with the design argument before deciding that, the multiverse was the only possible rebuttal? And see, I get Gavin being wrong about fine-tuning. That's perfectly understandable. The problem is that he's not even conversant about it, like not even in a basic way. He has such a huge blind spot to what people are saying about it that it makes me wonder whether he's explored the topic anywhere outside the carefully curated material of his own religion.
That is, that there's zillions of universes out there and we just happen to be in the right one. And I remember when I discovered that's not really in dispute, that that's the primary response.
Not to keep harping on this point, but how do you arrive at the conclusion that something is the primary response to an argument and that it's otherwise not in dispute? Like, you would have had to gone out there and done a really serious sample of all the things people say about it, right? So I'm just legitimately curious how Gavin can not know what anybody says about this and actually think that he knows what the primary argument is. I think we're seeing something very fundamental about how he approaches deconstruction or arguments between ideas at all.
I'll never forget when I discovered that. I thought, so maybe the idea of a creator God isn't so crazy if that's the alternative.
Now, this is telling, and I think it's fairly common among Christians. Notice that I said I think it's fairly common, not that I think that this is the only way any Christian has ever dealt with this. This misses the whole point of bringing the multiverse into this conversation. The point isn't that people are specifically invested in the multiverse as a concept. They certainly don't want you to live differently because of the multiverse. It doesn't impact your thinking in any way, or it's not meant to. And if somebody brings up the multiverse, that's just their way of saying that there are a lot of alternatives, so why not just step back a little bit and recognize this is just a mystery and leave it at that. However, Gavin's takeaway is not, there are a lot of possibilities, so let's not jump to conclusions. He takes the number of possibilities as permission to jump to his existing conclusion. I simply don't see what kind of thoughtful deconstructive process could lead back to such non-introspective, self-validating behavior. After talking more about fine-tuning in the multiverse, he goes back to another favorite, the moral argument.
And then you come to the moral argument. And here is where, I've always followed William Lane Craig and these other great apologists who talk about the objectivity of moral values and duties is best explained by God and this kind of thing.
No, I'm not going to debunk the entire moral argument because I've done it before and it would be kind of silly. But what's striking is how standard this whole thing is. Just like with the first cause argument or the argument from design, everything he says just sounds so straight out of scripted apologetics that it really doesn't sound like he's explored anything outside that realm. He even said he's always followed William Lane Craig and other apologists. Now, I don't want to take that wrong, and it would be all too easy to read too much into the word always, but it does sound an awful lot like those are the only sources he goes to for intellectual conversation about his faith. Or if not conversation, for sources to inform his faith.
But what really struck me as I did my research for my book is how devastating practically and psychologically and culturally the alternative is. And I don't mean that atheists are like that. I think atheists are often wonderful people, and my theology would lead me to expect that because of the idea of creation in God's image. And so I don't mean this in any way for people who hold the worldview, but the worldview itself.
So he gives us the atheist, you're not bad as people thing, it's just your worldview. How very magnanimous of you. But, I really don't care how condescending it is. What I'm more interested in is how standard it is. Bringing this up and how he brings it up is just such standard script for apologists that it, again, just seems like that's the only place he's getting his ideas.
And I think the older atheists, and people can watch my video on this, I think the older atheists like Nietzsche and Sartre and people like that saw that pretty clearly and pretty well and expressed it with admirable courage. That when you don't have a supranatural standard, everything does come down to evolution. And the evolutionary mechanisms that determine animal behavior are a reductive explanation for human behavior and thought. So it all comes back to that, survival of the fittest. And in such a worldview, I don't see how. It's not just the strong devour the weak, period.
Well, you should be able to see that. The evolutionary process produces conscious beings with a variety of instincts, including instincts to be empathetic and helpful to others. Now, these instincts don't necessarily have to have an immediate survival benefit. But in this case, they do. They help us survive as a species by cooperating. So if you take one species that is actually building a society and working together because they cooperate and care about each other, and then another society where everybody's just trying to get stronger so they can, how did he put it?
The strong devour the weak.
Oh yeah, that's right. Then who's going to have the advantage? The cooperative one. It doesn't matter how strong you get. You could dominate everybody around you for a period of time, but you're constantly going to be watching your back, and someone's going to come for you eventually, right? And even if you did succeed against your own kind, you'd still be vulnerable to the other species that hadn't, whittled itself down through infighting like a bunch of barbarians. So how can you possibly think that just getting strong as an individual is a benefit versus being empathetic and cooperative? See, the problem is not that evolutionary mechanisms are a reductive explanation for human behavior. It's that Gavin gives a reductive explanation for evolutionary mechanisms. Survival of the fittest is not the only factor in evolution. It certainly doesn't define the goal of every species that evolves. All it does, literally all it does, is describe how some species have survived in the wild and others haven't. That's it. It's a description. It doesn't define what we want to do as people. We don't make survival of the fittest our goal because of the theory of evolution any more than we make falling down our goal because of the theory of gravity. It's a purely silly misunderstanding. But I know you all know that already because, well, it's just stupidly obvious. And therein lies the problem. Not only does Gavin have a blind spot to a ton of things that he should know if he'd wandered anywhere outside his faith, but the things he repeats about them are misunderstandings so verbatim out of Christianity that it's clear that's just where he's resided. I just can't see how he says these things if he's explored anywhere outside of traditional Christian apologetics. Maybe I'm jumping at conclusions, but I don't see how that could have happened. Very few people misunderstand evolution the way he does unless it was explained to them by a creationist. And people don't keep misunderstanding it that way unless they just keep listening to creationists instead of, actually learning things about it. Go talk to somebody qualified if you're hoping to deconstruct.
And that's the some explanation for reality and particularly biological reality. So I find the moral argument to be very powerful because of what it means at a practical level as well as its logical force. I find it to be the only pathway forward with hope and dignity. And, if you value things like individual human rights, that we shouldn't kill off the elderly. It's hard in a strictly naturalistic worldview to see why that's right.
So here's a question. Is belief in God all that stands between Gavin and wanting to kill the elderly? I'd hope not. And I honestly don't think it does. I think he has enough of a fundamental regard for their well-being that he would not want to kill them even if he stopped believing that God exists. That's what makes me want to not kill the elderly even though I hold a naturalistic worldview. See, this is the danger in trying to speak for what other people should think are right or wrong based on a position they hold that you do not. You're likely just to show that you don't understand their position. And in his case, he's misunderstanding their position in a way that was drawn from standard apologetics and shows that it was not further informed by what people actually believe.
I'm not saying that people who hold to that worldview will do that. I'm just saying the rationale, in other words, the ontological basis for morality itself is really hard on a naturalistic worldview.
Yeah, it is hard. It is very hard to get down to the bottom of questions of how we should behave and why. But I don't think a proper reaction to the difficulty of that question should prompt us to retreat back to the childhood question of who's in charge and why should I listen to them. And then when that question gets difficult, you strike down one more human authority figure because they're arbitrary and get to a God figure. Not a constructive way to deal with a problem. And if you're still dealing with it that way, that just shows us another part of your faith that was not well deconstructed.
So those are just some of the things that I've gotten to where it's like, okay, here's where I'm at. I'm going through this process. I'm seeing, this feeling of the ground is less firm beneath my feet in terms of the landscape of American evangelicalism, and in terms of some of the beliefs that I have grown up with and I've kind of had to, I say, outgrow over the years. But then at the same time, as I keep working at it, I'm seeing that the core of my faith, the idea that God makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, it's good that he deconstructed the landscape of evangelicalism and found himself opposed to some of its more radical elements. That really is good. I'm not trying to take that away from him, and I legitimately am happy that he did that. However, if he just deconstructs those specific elements and does not get to the bottom of how they, reflect something about his faith, I don't really see it as deconstruction in any meaningful way, at least not deconstruction of his beliefs themselves. And if he didn't really deconstruct those beliefs themselves, then what does he mean when he says that he deconstructed his faith and it became stronger? His faith is going to stay as strong as it always was because he didn't really touch that sphere of actual belief. He went and addressed MAGA, Ravi Zacharias, evolution, while still being, committed to the Genesis account. He deconstructed all these things out here, didn't even touch this. So how is this supposed to change? And how is it supposed to mean anything when you say your faith was stronger in the end?
The idea that there does seem to be an individual who was the most famous and influential human being of all time. The largest religion is founded in his name, and the most diverse religion, and he's a pretty astonishing person. And he does seem to have claimed to be divine, and there's a limited number of explanations for that.
Now, this is where something clicked, and I really started to get my mind around a core issue with seeing this whole thing as a deconstruction story. Deconstruction involves breaking something down into its component parts and looking at each piece one at a time, just to get a fresh look at it. This is how you shed your preconceptions and look at your beliefs from the view of an outsider, or at least you get yourself as close as you can to that. The way Gavin tells his story doesn't really give me any indication that he did any of that. As I've been pointing out throughout this video, 1, he shows a blind spot to knowledge and perspectives that are just incredibly common to anybody outside the faith, and 2, most of the conclusions he reaches after deconstruction sound like he's just repeating explanations from inside the faith by rote. And I'm sorry, these do not sound like the markers of someone who took their faith apart and re-examined it in light of new ideas. The conclusions are just too textbook. The way he explains it just sounds straight out of church. When you're that stuck in the flow of language used by a belief system, you're probably still stuck in the flow of thought used by that belief system. And that flow doesn't stay intact through the process of deconstruction. You might have some of the same ideas, but the way you express it shouldn't sound that similar. Now, I do think that Gavin is telling his story sincerely. I just think that he's been trained to put up defenses and automatically accept some answers while totally rejecting others out of hand. So if a troubling idea cuts close to core ideas you don't want to deconstruct, you just kind of carefully put it away. If you run into a rote explanation by William Lane Craig that kind of puts something to bed, then you just eagerly embrace it. It's easy to do this and maybe think you've kind of deconstructed when you're just kind of playing ball within the rules of apologetics. And what he said in this last part is the clearest example of that so far. He assumes the scope and influence of Christianity implies something supernatural about a real Jesus, but I don't think he'd consider that the scope and influence of other religions imply anything supernatural about their religious figures. He says Jesus was an astonishing person based solely on the religious texts written about him. But would he even take a second to look at other religious documents that depict other people in remarkable ways? He suggests Jesus might be supernatural because of the limited number of explanations for why Jesus would claim to be divine, or to put it more accurately, why the stories depict him as saying he was divine. But would he even start applying this kind of, it can't be a plane, it can't be a cloud, so it must be a UFO type of reasoning to a figure in any other supernatural story? I really don't think so. These are belief-validating trains of thought, not exploratory lines of reasoning. And when you exercise them in such familiar terms, it simply doesn't look like deconstruction. It looks like the same basic internal thought-stopping mechanisms implied by pretty much every religious person determined to stay in their religion. Now, I'm sure Gavin did have some troubling doubts, and I think he's telling the most sincere story he can about how he worked through them. But the way he did does not sound like he really explored that far. It sounds too self-soothing. It sounds too much like he's trying to get back to the right answer and that he didn't go out far enough before getting back to it. It also sounds like he is trying to use this story as a counterexample and that he structured it kind of rigidly in order to make it serve as a counterexample so that he could show people that you do land back your faith when you're done. And that just doesn't really work as a deconstruction story and doesn't reflect much in the way of serious deconstruction on your part. And look, I've said it before, but I'm not trying to gatekeep the word deconstruction. But if your goal is to model landing at a specific answer, and through your journey you were committed to a specific answer, then whatever you did probably does not fit common usage of that word. And more than that, your story is going to reek of the how do you do fellow kids vibe of somebody trying to co-opt a genre for instructional purposes. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostet, Dark Side of Delight Productions, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.